Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Junkyard Dawgcast. I'm your host, Jordan Hill. Have another preview episode of the podcast. Getting ready for number 12 Georgia hosting number 7 Tennessee Saturday night, 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time on ABC. And to help us preview this game, we got Go Vols 24/7's Patrick Brown on with us to tell us more about the Volunteers, what we need to know about this Tennessee team as they go into what feels like a monumental game for both teams in terms of the college football playoff. Patrick, first off, thanks for joining us. How's everything going up in Tennessee this week as we get ready for this big game?
It's going well. There's just getting straight to it. There's a mix of anxiety and probably anger now for Tennessee fans. Anxiety about the status of Nico Iamaleava after he didn't play in the second half against Mississippi State last week. And probably the newer emotion is anger at the college football playoff rankings that came out on Tuesday night. Tennessee was jumped by both Indiana and BYU. And that, as you touched on, certainly brings a lot of implications for Tennessee if they lose this game on Saturday. And that has also got people upset. And, well, they're also mad that the committee chair, who is the Michigan athletic director, came out and was like, Indiana and BYU had great wins against, see who they won. It's Michigan and Utah. So, two of the biggest flops in college football, and so, but that was not a pleasing answer to hear for Tennessee fans. But we at Go Vols 24/7 appreciate the extra traffic from the outrage.
Yeah, I was going to say, if there's one thing Tennessee and Georgia fans can agree on this week, it's hating the College Football Playoff Committee, because I know
Right.
there were a lot of Georgia fans upset about Georgia falling down to 12, where they would not be in the College Football Playoff if it was to start this week. Well, Patrick, let's start with sort of big picture where this Tennessee team finds itself. It's got the one loss to Arkansas, still very much in the College Football Playoff conversation, as we're saying. What's sort of the mood around this Tennessee program going into this game, especially understanding that it is going to be a very big test on the road in Athens?
Yeah, I think this is one of those big game situations, and Tennessee under Josh Heupel has played a lot of these games. You go back to the 2022 season. They were, Florida coming to town, Alabama coming to town. Obviously, they went to Georgia that season. They had the game at LSU that season. Last season, they had some big games as well against the same kind of teams. Georgia and Alabama were big ones for them last season. So, and the Alabama game this year as well. So they've kind of, this used to be maybe new territory for Tennessee, but now it's something that they're encountering multiple times a season. So you could even go back to the Oklahoma game this year. I know Oklahoma's not very good, but that was certainly an occasion with the Sooners playing their first SEC game. Josh Heupel coming back to his alma mater, where he obviously was so successful as a player and a coach. So, this team has been through a lot of big games. And so I think that's sort of the mindset. Josh Heupel's message is he's never really shied away from playing these big games and understanding the stage. He's always told his players that, you've worked hard to put yourself and put your team in position to play these kind of games. But that doesn't mean you need to treat them any differently per se during the week. Obviously, as it's human nature for these players to kind of just know that, hey, we're playing Georgia this week. This is a big deal. Georgia's obviously been sort of the standard in the SEC, if not all of college football over the past several years. So naturally you get more excited about that and you get more fired up, and maybe you're a little bit more amped as you go watch film and this, that, and the other, but you still got to keep your routine. Josh Heupel's a big routine guy. So he and the staff are going to be encouraging that this week and trying to get them to focus on what they need to do from Sunday through Friday and even, Saturday during the day, because it's such a late game, to do all of those things to make sure that they play their best and give themselves a chance to win on Saturday night.
Tennessee 8-1 coming into this matchup. Well, Patrick, let's talk a little bit about Nico Iamaleava. Obviously, he's going to be a big part of this conversation because of the injury he sustained in that Mississippi State game. Now, I'll say this as a caveat to everyone listening to the podcast, that we are recording this on Wednesday, so we still haven't seen that first availability report. Obviously, more can change as this week goes on. But what's your feel for this situation with Nico? And let's just say he's not able to play. What does that mean for the Tennessee offense?
Well, Jordan, I think at this point of the week, we're right in the middle of it, Wednesday afternoon. I think it's still to be determined. Josh Heupel came out after the game the other night against Mississippi State and said that they anticipated that Nico would be ready to go for Georgia. He came out Monday and said that felt like Nico was going to be in great shape to be able to play. He has been involved in the preparations this week. He has been out on the practice field the first couple of days of this week. Tennessee doesn't practice on Monday, but they have been on the field 2 days since Josh Heupel talked. He did say that Nico has been out there and has been with us. I think that's what he said on the SEC teleconference a little bit earlier on Wednesday. But those availability reports are kind of going to be the way to track it from this point forward. And I think the verdict will probably come Friday night, if I had to guess, because that's the one that'll come out after Tennessee travels. And if a guy doesn't travel, you're obviously going to list him as out. Tennessee kind of found that out earlier this season with Lance Hurd against Oklahoma. I think he was listed as questionable the first two nights. He didn't make the trip. So Friday night he's listed as out. So we'll have to see what those availability reports say. I don't know that they're going to come out and say for sure he's playing or not on Wednesday and Thursday night, but I think by Friday night it should be we should have an idea either way. So, but it's hard for me to picture Gaston Moore, Tennessee's backup quarterback, leading Tennessee into Athens and leading them to a victory. I will say that this Tennessee team is built maybe a little bit differently than some of the others have been in the past. They're not as necessarily quarterback centric, I would say. They haven't been winning games with Nico throwing for 350 yards. In fact, really, I don't think he had thrown for more than 200 yards against an SEC defense until a couple weeks ago against Kentucky when he looked really good. Now, I will say what would hurt Tennessee the most if they don't have him is that he's been playing well as of late. He kind of went through a little bit of a lull there where he was kind of struggling with some turnovers. Maybe wasn't seeing the field as well as he needed to. He's missing some shots down the field. He's maybe feeling the pass rush a little bit because their offensive line was a little bit shaky, particularly in that Oklahoma game and definitely in the Arkansas loss. That was sort of a big issue. So, but you go back to the second half of the Alabama game, he really kind of turned it on. You saw kind of the playmaking ability that he has. He seemed really in command since then, getting the football out where it needs to go, taking care of the football. You see some of that playmaking ability where he's able to get out of trouble and use his legs at times to make plays. And they've connected on more of those downfield shots. He threw 2 long touchdown passes against Mississippi State the other night over the top of defenders. So you saw more of what maybe you saw from him early in the season, and also what the total package could be. And so it's hard for me to see Tennessee going in this game without him and having a real chance to win. Gaston Moore is the backup. He's actually a walk-on. He's a 5th-year senior. He's been at Tennessee for all 4 years of Josh Heupel's tenure and actually came from UCF. That's where he started his career. So he's been in this offense his entire career, but doesn't have a ton of experience. He's been sort of the third string guy or even lower at times earlier in his career. And so hasn't got a lot of opportunities, but going into this season, he won the backup role over Jake Merklinger, who's a freshman from, I believe he's from Savannah. That I think Georgia recruited a little bit. Some of these recruitments kind of run together, but Gaston is the guy that is probably more talented than maybe his walk-on ability gives him, than that label might suggest. Obviously, he knows the offense very well and seemed to operate it pretty good the other night. The question is, does he have the ability to make some of those big kind of game-swinging, momentum-swinging plays that Nico has that potential, and it's hard to say that Gaston Moore doesn't. He's a very confident guy from what everybody tells, from what everybody says, but if you're Tennessee, you certainly want to go into this game with as full a deck as you can, and certainly Nico would be at the top of that list of guys you would want available for this one.
Obviously, folks need to stay glued to Go Vols 24/7 to keep up with the latest on Nico, because that is going to matter quite a bit in this game. Well, Patrick, let's talk about the run game. Let's talk about Dylan Sampson and what the Vols have been able to do throughout this season. I mean, one of the most productive run games in the entire country. What stands out the most about Dylan Sampson as a running back, and what the Vols have been able to do with their ground game week after week?
Yeah, this is another, I think, change from what we've become accustomed to Tennessee under Josh Heupel. Their sort of rise was built on Hendon Hooker and Jalen Hyatt, and even that 21 team had Cedric Tillman on it, who's finally starting to make plays in the NFL as well. And then obviously, last season, say what you will about Joe Milton, he could obviously throw the ball really far, and he was sort of the guy you thought of when you thought of that offense. But this is the second year in a row Tennessee's right now leading the SEC in rushing. They did it last year with Jalen Wright, who was a 4th-round pick in the NFL draft, had the first 1,000-yard season in Tennessee since Jalen Hurd way back in 2015. As crazy as that is, maybe to believe. But Sampson is a guy that's waited his turn the past couple of seasons. He's been sort of that third back behind Jalen Wright and Jabari Small, both guys, 2 guys that went over 2,000 rushing yards for their careers at Tennessee. So he was sort of his role was sort of inconsistent. He was sort of the change of pace guy. But, before this season, we saw kind of two examples we had two samples of him being sort of, RB1 and being the guy. And he sort of closed out a win against Kentucky last season in the fourth quarter with his ability to make plays as a runner and catching some passes. And then in the Citrus Bowl against Iowa, he ran for 133 yards. So that sort of set the tone or set the stage for him to do what he's done this season. And I think the most impressive thing is he's just been such a workhorse. And he talked during the offseason, and players and coaches too talked about how much he worked to sort of build his body up. And he's handling a workload that's pretty crazy when you look at it. I mean, he's not the biggest guy. I think he's around 5'11", around 200 pounds. And he's over 200 carries for the season already. I think he's averaging between 25 and 30 carries in their SEC games, which is crazy. I mean, you think about the beating that those guys take and the way that he's done it, but he's been able to shoulder that load and handle it. And he's got a great nose for the end zone. 20 touchdowns is a single season record already for Tennessee. He's probably got a good chance of being the career rushing touchdown leader if he keeps going by the end of the season. And I think you mentioned something on a video preview we did just before this, where Kirby Smart talked about him being sort of Alvin Kamara, and there are those similarities there. He first of all, he wears number 6. He is from Louisiana. I know Alvin's not from Louisiana, but obviously he's made his name with the Saints down there. So he's just a really, he's a very elusive runner. He's got a lot of speed and some acceleration and some shiftiness when he gets to the second level or he's out on the perimeter. But I think he's really improved between the tackles. He does a good job of getting the tough yards. He's got good contact balance where it always seems like he's spinning off guys or bouncing off guys or falling forward. He does have 3 fumbles over the last 3 games, having had none in throughout his career first, before that. So that's been a little bit of a trend that, and certainly I think he's sort of the guy that's going to be at the top of the scouting report for Georgia. As the run game as a whole, I think the offensive line is probably better than a lot of people think, just with how physical they play. And a change from Tennessee this season is they're playing a lot more 12 personnel and really kind of leaning on it. They brought in a couple of transfer tight ends and Miles Kitzelman from Alabama. He was a guy that he was a non-factor with the Crimson Tide, but he's been a starter and played really well. And then they brought in Holden Stays, who is from Atlanta, from Notre Dame. And so he was sort of I think Georgia was in that recruitment a little bit. There were some other teams going for Stays, and those two have kind of come in, particularly over the last 2 weeks. I think they've each played like 50 and 60 snaps each. They're just leaning on those guys. They do a lot of different things in the run game. They use different formations with those 2 tight ends when they're out there. They'll pull guards, they'll pull centers, they'll pull tackles. They'll do all those things. And when that group's executing, it's really kind of, if you dive into it, it's really kind of fun to see how creative they are and how well they're executing when it's going. So they've got to get it going in this game. Obviously, Jalen Wright had the long touchdown run against Georgia, but it's hard to think of a time over this 7-year losing streak that Tennessee's had much success running the football against Georgia. And obviously, if they're going to win this game, I think they obviously have to reverse that trend and get Dylan Sampson going. And I think Oklahoma is the only team that's held Sampson under 100 yards. So if Georgia can do that, it would be an accomplishment because not many teams have been able to do it.
Yeah, Georgia, I believe, is in the top 25 in rushing defense. Another good defense in terms of stopping the run. And yeah, Holden Stays. I remember he visited Athens at one point last offseason, and then he winds up going to Tennessee. When we look at this offense, Patrick, under Josh Heupel, over the last few years, there's been those receivers who really stand out, the guys who they can count on to make plays down the field and generate a lot of yards. What do you make of this receiving core? Who are the names to know as part of that receiving core?
Yeah, Jordan, I would say they've been, I don't say underwhelming necessarily. I don't think they've been bad. I think they have left some plays out on the field, and they've got some guys that have been playing banged up for a few weeks now. Squirrel White was their leading receiver last season out of the slot. He's sort of a smaller, quick kind of guy. And he's been dealing with a shoulder injury since the Arkansas game that's maybe limited him some. He did catch his first touchdown of the season last week against Mississippi State. So he's a guy that can get behind the defense in the right matchup out of the slot position. Brew McCoy is still there, coming off that scary injury last season. He's been solid, but sort of he kind of comes and goes in terms of how many targets he gets on the outside there. Obviously, he's a big physical guy that certainly will need, this could be a game where he's needed just with how physical Georgia plays on the outside. That obviously has been a big story in these matchups, is that Georgia's just really physical, and Tennessee's receivers, haven't always been able to win those matchups consistently. So you got to make contested catches in this league, and particularly in this game with the talent that Georgia's got in the defensive backfield. Chris Browse is a Tulane transfer that's popped up here and there with a catch. Honestly, their best receiver has been Dante Thornton Jr., who also, with all the attention on Nico this week, he got banged. Thornton got banged up last week too. And we'll see his status for this game as well. But he's been their big play guy. I think he's got 5 catches for more than 50 yards, a couple of them touchdowns. He had a 73-yard touchdown against Mississippi State, had a 66-yard touchdown, I think, against Oklahoma. Got loose for a big play against Alabama as well. So I think he's averaging like 25 yards a catch. He doesn't have a lot of catches, but he's sort of the big play guy. And so, if they don't have him, I mean, he's been their best receiver all season. So that could be a big miss if he's not able to go, or if he's less than 100%. He's been sort of banged up too. So some of these guys have been beaten up, but Thornton's the big play guy that I think can be sort of that game changer, just because it seems like most of his catches are over the top down the field. He's obviously an explosive player. He came over from Oregon in 2023, was really injury hit last season, never could really get on track, but he kind of came into this offseason with a different mindset and was playing a little bit freer, and you see it show on Saturdays with some of the plays he's making. But they've just had some plays. They've had, the way this offense goes, they're going to have guys open downfield. Just sort of the spacing and the man coverage they make you play. And Tennessee's just been, their percentage rate on hitting them hasn't been great, whether it's been Nico overthrowing it, whether it's been guys not making plays. Some of their best plays last week were just drawing pass interference penalties when Gaston was in the game. So, they need some of those guys to make those plays, and particularly in this game where you're going to be challenged on the outside.
Yeah, you mentioned guys being banged up. I mean, that's sort of the nature of where you get in SEC football in mid-November, just people banged up. And I did want to mention for the people watching this live, we reported on Wednesday that running back Cash Jones for Georgia dealing with a foot injury now. We saw him in a boot. So that is going to be another blow for Georgia as these teams, across the country try to get through what's left of the season, because it is a very physical, taxing game, and you've seen that with both teams. Now, Patrick, flipping to the defense, what do you feel like are the greatest strengths of this Volunteers defense? And again, who are the names to know on that defense?
Well, I think you got to start with the defensive line. That's been the strength of this defense all season. We kind of knew it was going to be a strength, even going back into the spring. They've played really good football up front under Rodney Garner, who obviously has a long history at Georgia. The defensive line coach that's put, he's had a great career, great resume that he's built. Starting at Tennessee back in the 90s. Obviously, he was at Georgia for a long time. He's been at Auburn, and he's done really good work at Tennessee. Tennessee's defensive line is, they've been near the top of the SEC in tackles for loss all 3 seasons, and they were obviously very high up in sacks last season as well. So that's where you got to start. And this group is really deep. I mean, they'll play 6 defensive tackles. They'll play 3, 2.5 kind of Leo guys, which is sort of the hybrid. That's the James Pierce Jr. position that plays on the edge. Josh Josephs is a guy from, I think, outside of Atlanta that's played well this season as a junior. And then, at the other defensive end spot, they if they're healthy, they'll play 3 guys. Tyree West was one of those guys, but he was out last week. We'll see again what his status is for this game as well. So, I mean, they go 10, 12 deep without much of a drop off. And so they've got some veterans in there. They've got some guys that can, disrupt things. And for most of the season, it's been one of those guys pops up here and there, and so, but probably the most consistent guys have been Amari Thomas, who's a 5th-year senior in the middle. Pierce I think has a sack in 6 straight games. He started a little bit slow, but I'm not sure where he is in terms of like the pressures leaders in the SEC, but I think he's up there. He's impacted the game. They just have guys that, pop up and make a play, and it could be any of them. So that's what makes them a challenge. They do some different things. They'll switch some things up in terms of twists and pressures and things like that. But that group's also really good against the run when you've got some depth of defensive tackle and some big bodies that can hold the point and play vertical and get in the backfield. That's where they're effective. Now, the last 2 games, they've given up 168 rushing yards to Kentucky and 179 to Mississippi State. So they've given up some more chunk play kind of runs over the past couple of games. And so they've got to get that shored up regardless of who's running the ball for Georgia, just because, and regardless of how the offensive line is shaping up for the Bulldogs, just because if you can't stop the run, that's obviously going to limit your ability. But the other 2 levels of the defense have sort of come along. They lost Keenan Peely, who was their starting middle linebacker against Florida. He was making a big impact. He's a 7th-year senior, 26-year-old middle linebacker that has been playing a lot of football, missed all but a half of last season with injury. So he's sort of been bitten hard. But Jeremiah T. Lander, who's I think from Gainesville, and Arion Carter, who was a big recruiting win over Alabama out of Middle Tennessee. Those guys have been the starters, and I think Jalen Smith is from Grayson. He's been playing a lot as a redshirt freshman. So, they're working it through at linebacker, and then in the secondary, they've got two corners that I think have been sort of the building blocks there. Jermod McCoy is a transfer from Oregon State that's been a really pleasant surprise. There were a handful of teams that were after him in the portal after he played quite a bit in the Pac-12 last season. You think about some of the guys he went up against up there with Michael Penix and Bo Nix and some of those offenses that he faced and held his own as a freshman, and a freshman that mostly played wide receiver in high school. So he's a Thorpe Award semifinalist. So he's played really well. It's really tight coverage. He's really athletic. Had a great pick against Ryan Williams in that Alabama game in the end zone. And then Ricky Gibson III is the other cornerback as a sophomore. He's probably the more physical guy. So those guys are playing well. Will Brooks at safety is again a walk-on. He's maybe the Tennessee version of Dan Jackson. Sort of an interesting parallel in this game, but he's played great this season. Had a pick six against NC State, stealed the Alabama game with an interception. So he's played really well. And then freshman Boo Carter is from Chattanooga. He's sort of come along, started the last two games, had a pick against Mississippi State last week, and then is also adding something in the return game as well as a punt returner, having taken over that role last week too. So they forced a lot of turnovers, this Tennessee defense. I think it's 4 in the past 9 games. I think they've forced at least 2 in every SEC game except the one they lost, I believe, which was Arkansas. So they're getting the ball and taking it away. They randomly are very good at getting the ball right back after their offense turns it over. It's sort of a unique thing. I don't think that's an actual stat that is anywhere, but I think Tennessee would lead it when you think about how quickly they've been able to get the ball back after their own offense gives it away. So that's been good. Tackles for loss is something they're pretty adept at. They're second in the SEC in run defense, even with some of the leakiness from the past 2 games. And they do a good job of limiting big plays, maybe a little bit less over the past 2 weeks, which is, again, something they need to kind of nip that trend in the bud, particularly in this game. And then also they've, like I said, the other thing is third down defense. That was the other one. I think they're second nationally in third down defense, doing a really good job of getting off the field. So Tim Banks is the defensive coordinator. This is his 4th year in the system. He took over a defense that was really kind of void of talent on that side of the ball, and is particularly depth. And so they've built that up. This has been sort of a multi-year project where they've recruited, they've developed guys. When you look at guys like Pierce and Josephs and Arion Carter, they've worked the portal well with guys like McCoy that I mentioned. Jackson Moy is a defensive tackle that's come in from Stanford and been really nice. So they've sort of built it over time, and they've got they've done a good job playing really good team defense. You don't really see them out of position a lot, and they're flying around the ball and making plays, and that's what you got to do. You have to be well rounded and do a lot of those little things like force turnovers and make plays in the red zone and get takeaways and get off the field on third down if you're going to be good enough to hold 9 opponents, again, 9 teams under 20 points. I don't know that Tennessee's played the best 9 offenses in the country. But even against Alabama, they held that offense in check pretty well. Had Jalen Milroe pretty frustrated. So you have to do a lot of things right to play as well as they're playing, and they're going to need that group to be as sharp as they've been all season in this game.
Patrick, before we take a break, I always feel bad on these preview podcasts because I kind of just tee up the guests and let them talk, for 30 or 45 minutes. But I want to give you an opportunity to ask me, are there questions that really stand out to you about this Georgia team? Are there things you're interested in from the Georgia perspective before this game?
Yeah, I mean, Georgia's got 2 losses and it's mid-November. It's unusual territory, I think, for all of us. And I know Georgia's played a really tough schedule. Not many teams have had to go to Ole Miss and go to Texas and go to Alabama. That's obviously pretty unique. But my question would be just, what has happened for Carson Beck to go from, being one of the top quarterbacks in the upcoming NFL draft class to a guy that's thrown the most picks in the SEC. I know Josh Heupel earlier this week was asked about some of his struggles and kind of pointed to, this is sort of his general answer when he's asked about quarterbacks and maybe them struggling, is he says that it takes all 11 on the offense. So would you agree with that it's some of those issues on Beck, or how much of it is on him versus other parts of the offense not doing what they need to do to help him?
I would say the majority is on Beck because, coming out of that Florida game where he threw 3 interceptions after throwing 3 interceptions the previous game against Texas, he kind of talked about pressing a little too much. He talked a little bit about, living to fight another day, whether that's taking a sack, throwing a ball out of bounds. But I'll say, too, that the guys around him could do a better job. They showed a stat during the Ole Miss game. Georgia's receivers have the most drops of any team in the country. I think they're up to 28 at this point. And as I pointed out on our live podcast after the fact, second is UAB. And Patrick, UAB is not very good. There's not a lot of offensive statistics you want to be right up there with the Blazers on. So I think that, on one side, we kind of didn't put as much stock into what losing a Brock Bowers and a Ladd McConkey and even a Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint would mean for Carson Beck. And I think that it was very natural for the people who followed this team to say, okay, guys like Dominic Lovett and Dylan Bell are going to take that next step and be maybe all SEC caliber receivers. And we just haven't seen that. We've seen good things from both of those guys, Arian Smith. Now, it hasn't helped that two of the ex receivers, Rara Thomas and Colby Young, have not been with the team. Rara was dismissed before the season. Colby has been gone since the Alabama game, so that's certainly made it tougher. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of it is on Carson. I think he's pressed at times. I think that he's trusted his arm a little bit too much at times. I think about specific interceptions where if there's a window, Patrick, it's a little one. And it's one where it's just you're not going to be able to make that play 9 times out of 10. So I do think that he didn't play that bad against Ole Miss. I think the biggest problem was the offensive line is just beat down. And as that game wore on, the protection just wasn't there. And Georgia had to lean a lot on screenplays and trying to make something happen. And Ole Miss knew it. And by the time that happened, I mean, the hay was in the barn. The game was over. So, yeah, I mean, again, not all on Carson, but I'd say there's a lot of it decision-making wise. Just putting a little too much trust in himself. And then I think once one of those interceptions happen, it kind of presses and it just makes the situation worse.
As you mentioned Dylan Bell there, he had a great game against Tennessee last season. He made some catches that, Tennessee had guys in position and he just made plays. I mean, that's pretty crazy. And so, yeah, it was like that a little bit too for Tennessee last season when they lost Jalen Hyatt and Cedric Tillman. And by the end of the season, I think they were playing 4 scholarship receivers. They'd obviously lost Brew McCoy. Dante Thornton had been in and out of the lineup. And then when he started to kind of turn a corner, he gets hurt too. So I think that was one of those situations where kind of, you expected, it's a Josh Heupel offense, they can, they'll keep clicking because it's just what it does. But, it's hard to replace receivers, especially guys that are game changers like Bowers and McConkey were. And obviously both those guys are doing really well in the NFL. So I think that only magnifies just how hard it is to replace it. And it just kind of shows too, just how difficult college football is in general. Because if even a program that seems, just from out the outside, like Georgia, that seems so, I don't want to say, I don't really know how to term it, but immune to having issues replacing players just because of how they recruit and all that. It's kind of start to see that. And we've probably even Alabama's had those moments too, where some of, a couple of years there, some of their receivers were a little bit down compared to the run they had. And so it's interesting that you point that out.
For sure. And it's easier said than done when it comes to reloading on either side of the ball. Well, we will take a quick break, come back, and we're going to talk specifically about this game, what we're hearing from the coaches and the players in the lead up to this matchup, and what we expect to see on Saturday. As we turn our focus to Saturday, I'll tell everybody who is watching this live, throw your score predictions in the comments. I will rattle off as many of them as we get once we get toward the end of this show. Now, Patrick, what has the conversation been like from Josh Heupel and the Tennessee players this week? What have they been saying about this Georgia game, having to come to Athens, playing this game at Saturday night? What sort of stood out to you about their thoughts on this game?
Well, just listening to Heupel and to Dylan Sampson this week, kind of talking about the Georgia defense, and they've said that they look at it and it's a typical Georgia defense, and obviously Georgia has sort of reset the standard with some of those units they've had under Kirby Smart and how well they played at all three levels. And, I think that's certainly true when you look at Georgia's, defensive front. They're strong at up front, can hold the point of attack, as Sampson noted. And he talked about their linebackers being able to cover a lot of ground and make plays and be physical. And then just talked about, the safety's ability to come downhill and fit in against the run. And so that's probably one of the biggest things that Tennessee's got to figure out in this game is they've not figured out this Georgia defense. They've not been able to put up a lot of points and a lot of yards against it. And it's really the only team that they haven't under Josh Heupel. You look at the Alabama game a couple years ago, they scored 52, and they've put up their big days against just about everybody they've played except this game. I think the most they've scored is 17 points in this game. So they look at this Georgia defense as good as the rest. And as you sort of touched on, I think you touched on it earlier, Ole Miss had to kick 5 field goals. And I think that's going to be a key in this game because Tennessee's red zone offense has not been great, particularly of late. They have left a lot of points on the field. You look at the Mississippi State game last week, they could have been up 21-0 about 10 minutes into the game, but had a fumble inside the 10. I mentioned Sampson has had some fumbling issues of late. That was one of them. And then they got the ball right back on an interception and started at, first and goal at the 9 and ran 4 run plays and couldn't get it in. They got stopped on 4th and goal at the 1. So, and in Kentucky, they had 8 red zone possessions and I think only had 4 touchdowns. So, you're leaving a lot of points on the field. That's a situation where they can't do that in this game. So, they've not been able to figure out this Georgia defense, and they know it's going to be tough because they see a lot of the similarities from past matchups with what the Bulldogs have on that side of the football.
Now, as we mentioned earlier, we are recording this on Wednesday, so a lot will come out in terms of injuries and who might be out and who might be in. But you'd already mentioned, Patrick, we talked about Nico, mentioned Dante Thornton. Who are the other Tennessee players whose injury situations we need to be following the next few days?
Yeah, I would point to Deshaun Bishop in the backfield. You mentioned that Georgia with Cash Jones is they're not going to potentially not going to have him in this game, and Bishop has been the guy that's been sort of that RB2 all season. Now he hasn't gotten a ton of reps just because Dylan Sampson has been so reliable for them, and Darrell Sims, who's the new running backs coach for Tennessee, said this week it's when Sampson gets going and gets hot in games, it's hard to take him out just because of how well he's playing. But Bishop has been sort of that reliable number 2 guy. He got banged up against Kentucky, did not play last week against Mississippi State. I think they ruled him out on the first availability report of the week. So I wouldn't say that bodes well for this week, although, we'll see. But they're really young and unproven behind him. And so that could, however much Sampson can take. And he got sort of hip drop tackled last week and was favoring his ankle at one point. It looked worse than it turned out being. But Sampson's a guy that obviously is carrying the wear and tear of 9 games, a lot of SEC games. And so, you need, you're him getting banged up away from having to play a freshman in Peyton Lewis, who is a good looking prospect, but he hadn't really done anything from the first 3 games of the season on offense until he got in against Kentucky. And they gave him a drive in the first half, and he actually responded pretty well, had about 24 yards on 8 carries, scored his first touchdown. He is an elite track guy out of Virginia. He was a top 247 player. Right now he seems to be just a straight line guy. He doesn't really, not a lot of wiggle there at this point. He can get through a seam up the middle pretty quick, but if he sees a safety in front of him, his preferred style is to just try to run them over, which is it's tough to do in this league. But he's probably the next guy up if Bishop is out. Cameron Seldon is a guy that, again, was a highly recruited guy, was an athlete, played a lot of positions in high school, came to Tennessee to play running back. He was sort of set to be that second guy behind Sampson this season, but had a shoulder injury in the spring that caused him to miss a lot of the offseason. He actually did get back in time to play in the opener, but he's kind of been in and out of the lineup. So if Sampson, he's banged up, I don't think he'll be on the availability report because, just because of how tough he is, and there's not really any question at this point that he's going to play. But if he gets banged up early, if he gets hit in the wrong spot, you could be down to some guys that don't have a lot of experience on such a huge stage. So that would probably be the big one. I mentioned Tyree West earlier. I wouldn't say that he is not missed, but again, Tennessee's defensive line is so deep that They just play the other two guys in his position a little bit more and probably don't really skip a beat. And one of the guys that played more last week was Jason Jenkins, who actually had a strip sack in that game for a key turnover in the second half against Mississippi State. So I would say Thornton, obviously Nico, and then Bishop would maybe be that next guy that Tennessee needs to be keeping an eye on for this week.
When you look at Saturday's game, what in your mind are the keys for Tennessee? What has to go well for the Vols to have a chance to go into Athens on a Saturday night and come out with a win?
I'll pick one on each side of the ball. I kind of touched on it just a moment ago with the offense, but when they get chances to score and put points on the board, they've got to do it. This is an offense that, again, they're not, they went into this game 2 years ago averaging 45, 50 points, whatever it was. This offense is not at that level. So they can't afford to have turnovers in the red zone and miss field goals like they did against Kentucky. And that was another good sign last week, is that their kicker, Max Gilbert, bounced back and hit a career long, and he hit a 38-yarder just before the half and was like celebrating before the ball even went through the uprights. That had to feel pretty good for him after he missed 3 from inside 40 against Kentucky. So they have to score touchdowns when they get the opportunity. Your chances are going to be limited to put up points against Georgia. And that's just how it is when you play the Bulldogs. So if they've got chances to score, if they get inside the 20, if they're able to put drives together to get in scoring territory, they've got to maximize those situations. That would be something I would point to on offense, regardless of who's in the game at quarterback. And defensively, I think they've got to have their defensive line set the tone like they did early in the season, like they did against NC State, like they did against Oklahoma. The defensive line I thought was pretty good against Alabama, obviously, as well. That defensive line has got to bring it. And they maybe, I don't want to say dropped off a little bit the past 2 games, but they just haven't been as good when you look at some of the bigger runs they've given up. So Amari Thomas earlier in the season talked about the defensive line. When you go on the road, those guys have to set the tone, because if they're able to frustrate Georgia, that frustration could, kind of go back and forth between the team on the sideline and the fans in the stands. I mean, I'm sure Georgia fans are frustrated by what's been going on that side of the football for a lot of the season. And if you can play into that by, setting the tone early that you're going to create negative plays, you're going to cause sacks, you're going to get a turnover early. I think that's where Tennessee's got to start in this game. The start of this game is so important. I mean, we saw it last week with Alabama. They went on the road to LSU and had 2 touchdown drives right off the bat. They took control of that game early. And if you can take a crowd out of the game, then what is a daunting atmosphere at the start becomes maybe a little bit more manageable. So I think that's where Tennessee's they've got to start well in this game. Obviously, that's something, fast starts have been pretty much a staple under Josh Heupel the first 3 years. Not so much this year. They obviously went 3 games without even scoring in the first half. So that has been an issue. But if they're able to start fast and they're able for that defensive line to show up early and start wreaking havoc and wrecking stuff, then maybe that has an impact on the Georgia offense. I'm not sure. You could probably tell me better if what the psyche is for those guys. I mean, I think the psyche has impacted Tennessee in some of these games where they have a promising opening drive and they fumble or mess it up, and the offense kind of maybe goes in the tank for the rest of the half from there on out. So if Tennessee's able to have that kind of impact and do that early in this game with its defensive line, because that's their strength, then they may have a chance to keep Georgia down on the scoreboard enough to where whatever is available on its offense to piece together enough to score enough points. But if Tennessee's defensive line doesn't win, I don't see any chance that the Vols can win this game. That group obviously carries such a big responsibility, and you want your big guys, your big players, your impact guys to make the biggest impact in games like this. And so that's what Tennessee needs from those guys up front.
No, I think you hit on. I mean, that's the matchup to me, is Georgia's offensive line against Tennessee's defensive line. And Patrick, you hit on the thing that I really hadn't considered, but that hot start for Tennessee could be make or break, because the folks that are going to be in red and black in the stands on Saturday are already really frustrated. So if they come out, if Tennessee gets stops early, they're going to get upset. You probably hear some boos if we see a 3 and out or something like that. I mean, I hadn't really considered it, but if Tennessee can come out and score early, which, like you said, they haven't done a ton, I mean, that I think gives the Vols a huge boost and a real opportunity to win this game.
Yeah, I just go back to Tennessee's 2 road games in SEC play already this season. They go to Oklahoma, and the start wasn't perfect, but their defensive line, I mean, the first play of the game, Elijah Simmons, who's 6'2", all 6'2", 340 pounds of him, is into the backfield, wrapping up the running back right after he takes the handoff. I mean, it was kind of clear early in that game that Tennessee's defensive line was there and it meant business. And I think that impacted Oklahoma. I think it impacted the crowd because they were probably like, okay, all right, we hear all, that was a unique situation where, that fan base was probably thinking they could handle the SEC and it was not going to be a big deal. And then Tennessee rolls in there with, literally rolls in 3 groups on the defensive line, all, kind of taking control. And it's like, okay, all right, this is not good. And then you go to Arkansas, and Arkansas goes on a long first drive with their offense. They didn't punch it in the end zone. They actually kicked the field goal from like the 1 yard line. Probably should have scored. I think they might have had a touchdown at one point that got called back. But that just sort of set the tone. I mean, Arkansas converted, I think, multiple 3rd and 4th downs on that drive, took up about half the first quarter. And then Tennessee comes out, gets a penalty, I think 2 penalties on its first drive on offense, and went 3 and out. And that sort of just set the tone for what was going to be a nip and tuck game that Arkansas eventually won in the end. So the starts are so big on the road because of the impact the crowd can have. And obviously Tennessee, you go back to that game 2 years ago, that crowd was on another level that day. And it was deafening. And it definitely impacted the game. Tennessee had 7 false starts or something like that. So they were clearly impacted by the crowd. And so if you can start fast and get the crowd a little nervous and maybe a little anxious, sometimes that, we see it enough. I've covered enough Tennessee Florida games to know that if the crowd gets a little nervous and anxious, that it can sort of spill over to the team and maybe things tighten up and maybe you start pressing and things like that. So that's why the start's so important for this game. And given just where both teams are and what this game means.
Yeah, you mentioned that game 2 years ago. That is the loudest I've ever heard Sanford Stadium, and talking to folks who have covered Georgia for much longer than me, we're in agreement. So, I mean, that's going to be a huge piece of this game. Now, Patrick, how do you see this thing playing out? What do you expect to see on Saturday as these two teams fight, and very well could be a de facto playoff game between these two teams?
Yeah, it seems like that's what it's going to be. It seemed like the message from the playoff rankings this week was Tennessee, you better win this game or you're going to get shipped to the back of the line behind the other 2 lost SEC teams, which there's a lot of them. So I've gone back and forth on it this week. I see some vulnerabilities with Georgia right now in their current state, which is it's really almost hard to say just because of how dominant this program has been under Kirby Smart. It almost seems like they've been just impermeable. You watch these Georgia teams and you're like, where's the weakness? I mean, even last season they didn't win the national title, but I mean, it was hard to find. They had one off day. You get a bad call against Alabama, which has happened before to other teams in this league, and so and that bumps you out of the playoffs. Was that fair or not? I don't know. That's for another time. But it just seems, just listening to you and reading some of your guys' coverage this week, and even watching Georgia, it seems it's almost hard to believe. I mean, I had that game on last week in the press box at Neyland while Tennessee was warming up for Mississippi State, and it just seemed like every time I looked over, Carson Beck was running for his life or throwing an incomplete pass, and Ole Miss had guys, in space with no Georgia defenders around him. It was just kind of hard to, I kind of had half of an eye on it, but it was still kind of just hard to pick up on that. So, so I see Georgia as vulnerable, but I don't know that I can trust Tennessee, given that Tennessee hasn't exactly lit the world on fire. They've been winning games and they've been doing a lot of good things, but it's a different animal when you go on the road in this league. They've obviously had their issues on the road under Josh Heupel. When you go back to that Georgia game, the Arkansas game this season, obviously they went to South Carolina a couple years ago and got beat up pretty good. They've been such a shell of themselves when they leave Neyland Stadium. I think they're 24-4 at home under Heupel. And the only team that's beat him since midway through his first season has been Georgia, which was in 21, and then obviously last season too. So I just have a hard time seeing. I think Tennessee can win this game. I'm probably not going to pick it though, because it's just it's almost like I got to see it to believe it, because this has been such a lopsided rivalry over the past 7 years. And I've got it, I'm kind of in show me mode with Tennessee. This is a similar stage that they went into Athens on, 2 seasons ago, and they clearly were not ready. I mean, I think that day Georgia took it personally that Tennessee was ranked number one. And Georgia said, okay, if you want to, this is what a championship team and a championship program looks like. Well, now Tennessee's in a similar situation where they have a chance to sort of rubber stamp their credentials as a championship program. And if you want to be that, you've got to go win a game like this. And so, are they ready to handle it? I don't know. We'll see. But I would probably lean towards picking Georgia at this point. Even with some of the warts that they have. I think a lot of teams at the top of this league have some warts. And it's just going to come down who plays better on Saturday. But at this point here, as we record this, I'm leaning towards Georgia, and probably will end up leaning that way by the end of the week as well. And that obviously could change, depending on the status with Nico and some other guys for Tennessee, and probably for Georgia too.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, the Nico question of all this complicates it so much. But yeah, I mean, you look at this game, this is make or break for Georgia. We'll have the conversation, say, if Georgia does lose this, about can they still get in with 3 losses? I don't think so. I think last night was, the playoff ranking was clarification. You're not getting in with 3 losses. You're not getting in right now with 2 losses where Georgia stands. But it really hangs on this offensive line. They have to play out of their mind, which is a tall task because they're beat up. I've tried when I've written about this line to point out, like, nobody's blaming them for the situation. They're banged up. They're fighting through it. Kirby's talked about how tough this group is and how hard it is to try to get through an SEC season, but it's on them. I've got Georgia 21-10. The Nico question is a big part of the rationale there. I mean, again, I don't like leaning on betting lines, but Georgia being like a 9.5, 10.5 point favorite, that screams that Vegas knows something that we don't, or that they are very confident in Georgia returning from Ole Miss, having a week to try to get healthy and trying to make something happen at home. So I've got Georgia 21-10. Kip Adams has Georgia 24-20, very close game. And then Ben Wolk, he's picking Tennessee 24-17. So I'm sure our listeners are going to be real thrilled with that one. Patrick, thanks so much for coming on here. I want to give you an opportunity. Tell us what you guys got going on at Go Vols 24/7. Tell us the stuff y'all are working on, where folks can follow you guys, everything they need to know getting ready for this game.
Yes, we are at Go Vols 24/7 on Twitter, or I guess it's X now officially, and has been for a while. It's so habit for me to say just say Twitter. Sorry, Elon. But on Facebook as well. We have a YouTube channel as well where we post a lot of stuff, our own podcasts. We'll have our staff predictions at the end of the week on Friday as well, as long as our bold predictions for the game, where we sort of pick out. It's almost like sort of a betting deal where we kind of pick overs, unders. It's not specifically that, but it's an interesting sort of spin we try to put on the game. And obviously we'll have preview content throughout the week. And I know we're swapping some questions among you guys as well. So we'll have a presence on y'all's side of the network, and you'll be on our side of the network as well. So if you want to see what Jordan has to say, I know Wes Rucker is our polarizing at times columnist. Some people love him, some people just can't stand him, but he's on our side, so we're good with him. He'll have some interesting questions for Jordan this week in our Better Know a Foe feature. If you want to hear what Jordan thinks is in a can of Raid, that's where you want to go, which Georgia players he would take if he was stranded on an island. Fun stuff like that. Also plenty of stuff covering the game as well. So we will have a plenty of coverage and plenty of preview stuff to get you ready for this huge game. This is what we all love college football for, right? These games like this. And hopefully whichever team wins this game does get in the playoffs, and they don't just stock it with Big Ten teams.
We will see. Well, again, Patrick, thanks for coming on. Thanks to everyone who watched this live, everyone who is watching or listening to it after the fact. Go to Dawgs 24/7. Go to Go Vols 24/7, especially these next few days as we are watching these availability reports to see the injury situations for both teams. Go to Dawgs 24/7 on YouTube, on TikTok, all kinds of good content out there as this football season draws closer and closer to its end. So we'll wrap it up right there. For Patrick Brown, I'm Jordan Hill. Until next time, take care, everybody.